We're having trouble hearing.
I welcome everyone to this third and final session about the life and learning of the incredibly momentous figure of David Weiss Halivni, who I've mentioned died last year in Israel at the age of 94. I have an ambitious agenda today. I want to go through as much of my source sheet as possible, hopefully all of it, and leave some room at the end for questions. So we're going to drive through the source sheet, cover many of the issues, and tie up some of the loose ends from the first two lectures. If there's anyone on who didn't attend the first two, the recordings are available. But I'm going to get you up to speed, and we'll all be hopefully on the same page as we move through these sources from Halivni's work and by other figures about the issues that we'll be talking about. As I did last week, I started last week by showing a photo of Professor Halivni with Elie Wiesel. They grew up together and they were lifelong friends until the end of Elie Wiesel's life. It was a wonderful, poignant photo of the two of them in some library, I'm not sure which, but Halivni was in a cheerful mood. And I've mentioned that he was, despite the trauma and ordeal of the Holocaust that he experienced, that we'll talk about again today, he was generally a very upbeat, cheerful man. So I thought that picture captured his personality quite well. And I want to share with you for this final session another picture that I want you to carry with you as we engage in the discussion today. So I hope you can see the picture on the screen now. This is the picture from the title page of his memoir, The Book and the Sword, A Life of Learning in the Shadow of Destruction. This is Professor Halivni as a young boy of 11 on the right side here. And this was his family unit. I mentioned that his parents divorced when he was a very young boy. He was sent to live with his grandfather. This is his grandfather here with a beard. This is his mother sitting down in front, his aunt, and his sister, who in his memoir he describes as having some disabilities. But despite the formality of the photo, the family did not have much money. They were quite poor. I mentioned that Halivni used to win some money because of his mastery of the Talmud, even as a young boy. But he's pictured here at age 11. I'm going to make this a little bigger, hopefully, perhaps not. So this is Halivni at age 11. Only 4 years later, he received rabbinic ordination from the yeshiva in Sighet in Romania. The four other people in this photo were all murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. So he was the only person in his family to survive it. And again, he came to America, and his life became different. But I want you to carry this photo of him from this old world. He was essentially from, what we now call an ultra-Orthodox world, growing up in Eastern Europe. I've mentioned that his memoir makes clear they were a Hasidic family. Often people thinking of Halivni as an adult scholar don't think of him as Hasidic, but that was the world in which he grew up. He was immersed in the Hasidic world, and he moved away from it in his scholarship and in his sort of religious personality and perspective. So with that, can everyone see the source sheet now? Good, okay. So we're up to this third session, from tension to harmony. I've tried to lay out in the first two classes the sources of the tension that he felt in his life. The title of the course, again, is A Certain Amount of Harmony, which is a direct quotation that comes from his memoir. And I believe he thought he achieved a harmony, but it wasn't a perfect harmony. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation of the competing forces that he felt in his life between academic scholarship on the one hand and commitment to halakha, to Jewish law, and his religious piety on the other. So I've tried to clarify and define those sources of the tension in his life. And we began last week to talk about how he navigated that tension. And in this final session, again, I'm going to move through source sheets to really give you a sense, I hope, of the various elements of his immensely impactful life and his learning. But I want to try to give you a sense of the harmony that he thought he achieved. It may have been imperfect, but he fought hard his whole life to try to create harmony between those competing aspects of his life. So with that, let's get back to where we left off. And again, this section of the source sheet I'm labeling Toward a Solution, Navigating the Tension. And I wanted to start with a quotation from the Chazon Ish, who was a very important ultra-Orthodox rabbi. He really helped shape the Haredi world, particularly in Israel. But he was considered a leading figure of the ultra-Orthodox world. And I want to give you a sense of the sort of what I called last week the maximalist conception of revelation that Halivni really wanted to move away from. And he thought the rabbinic sources justified moving away from. The Chazon Ish wrote, everything written in the Talmud, whether in the Mishnah or in the Gemara, that's the commentary on the Mishnah, whether in Halacha, Jewish law, or in Agadah, even in rabbinic stories. So everything written in the Talmud, including rabbinic narratives, were things revealed to us, meaning through the rabbinic sages, through prophetic powers. And he means, so they were in some important sense divinely revealed. Whoever deviates from this tenet, this belief, is as one who denies the words of our rabbis, and his ritual slaughtering is invalid, and he is disqualified from giving testimony. So I just wanted to remind all of us so that we're all on the same page. This was the default conception. It wasn't universal, but it was the default conception of revelation in the world in which Halivni grew up, and which he thought was not a helpful or accurate conception of revelation. But it is the one to which he responded. And it was also the one from which certain of his critics in the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox world, that was the perspective that they shared. And they thought that his scholarship reflected a deviation from this belief, and therefore it was in certain respects, in their eyes, heretical. So that, again, I just wanted to give you a sense of the background, the default. And I wanted to remind all of us about what is the problem, what is the source of the tension that Halivni felt this poignant and really desperate need to solve in his own life. This is from an article, Chatu Yisrael, A Possible Solution to the Conflict of Pshat and Drash, that I worked on with him. Again, I was his teaching assistant from 1988 to 1991. So this is one of the first things I worked on with him. And in that article, Halivni wrote, this sometime idiosyncratic nature of rabbinic exegesis is, for the halachically committed Jew, and that's who Halivni was, no mere trivial or scholastic issue, for it impinges on the basic question of the validity and authority of tradition as forged and formulated through rabbinic midrash. The issue of the dichotomy, the division of pshat, the plain sense, and drash, the rabbinic interpretation, is particularly relevant to the modern reader of the Bible. The modern exegetical sensibility has embraced the primacy of pshat over drash, so the primacy of straightforward, contextual, simple meanings over more imaginative, disconnected interpretations of the text. Midrashic interpretation that seems unfettered by the plain, straightforward meaning of scripture, of the Torah, can be judged exegetically capricious and textually groundless. Needless to say, such a judgment of rabbinic exegesis must be theologically unsettling to the Jew committed to the authority of traditional halachic interpretation. So if you're committed, as Halivni was, to the Jewish legal system, to the Jewish halachic system that was based on rabbinic midrash, on rabbinic exegesis, it was, to say the least, disconcerting, at least it was to Professor Halivni, that certain rabbinic interpretations seemed to deviate dramatically, in his view, from the plain sense of the Torah verses. An attempt must therefore be made to diffuse the religious tension that is produced upon an awareness of the occasional discrepancy between scriptural pshat and rabbinic drash. The problem of the occasional disparity between pshat and drash thus constitutes a weighty theological issue, for it creates avenues for imputing either imperfection to the divine text. So on the one hand, that's an intolerable option, or illegitimacy to traditional rabbinic interpretation. That's also a very unpalatable option. So he had, if you focus on this occasional deviation between pshat and drash in Halivni's view, and this was, an incredibly sort of visceral problem for him, you were caught between a rock and a hard place. Either the Torah had defects in the text, or the rabbinic interpretation, the body of rabbinic interpretation, at times was simply capricious and ungrounded and unwarranted. That those two options were unpalatable. We will see that ultimately he actually did impute imperfection to the divine text. So he chose this option more often than not. And we will talk about that solution. I did want to spend a few minutes. We focused on the problem of pshat and drash, the deviation between the plain sense of the text and rabbinic interpretations. We focused on the text of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. But I wanted to give you some sense of the magnitude and import of his Talmudic studies. Halivni was known primarily as one of the great Talmud masters and commentators and scholars of the 20th century, perhaps of all time. And he wrote the English language books that I've mentioned. I worked on with him, Pshat and Drash, and a couple of English language articles. He was, in those English language books, he was talking about sort of the upshot of some of the conclusions he had reached in his Talmudic commentary. It's a complicated matter. I don't want to delve into it in any great depth. I was a student in his graduate seminar in Talmud. It was a challenging class. We focused on his magnum opus, Mekarodim Sorot. But I want to give you some sense of what it was that he thought he was engaged in his modern, critical, very innovative Talmudic studies. He writes, for critical Talmudic study of the kind that he engaged in, you first learn the text according to the traditional interpretations with the commentaries that have accumulated on the Talmud for the last 16 or 1700 years. And then you look at these commentaries and interpretations and ask. So he wasn't satisfied. He didn't settle by just mastering the Talmud and its traditional commentaries, which, as we saw at the age of 9, he had memorized 400 pages of the Talmud and the related commentaries of both Rashi and Rashi's disciples, the Tosafot. He won money for being able to answer all sorts of questions about those 400 pages of Gemara. But he wasn't satisfied simply resting there. He asks, in his work, tough questions about the text. He asks, do they honor those interpretations? Do they honor the integrity of the text, the context, the tenor of the words? Do the words support the interpretation of later sages, or is the interpretation forced upon the words of earlier sages? Do you have to shrink some of the text? Would the text be better if certain of its words were not there? You also ask, conversely, do you have to add something to the text? Are the words as presently constituted insufficient to contain the attributed interpretation? If the answer is yes, so if the answer is there seems to be a gap between earlier sayings of, let's say, the 4th and 5th centuries and later interpretations of rabbis who were commenting on earlier, even earlier, Tannaitic, the 1st and 2nd century statements that were succinct and terse, what he called apodictic. If there was a gap between those statements and later interpretations, the sort of analytical discourse that one finds when one opens the pages of the Talmud. He says then the interpretation is forced. And this is really the sort of core of his Talmudic scholarship. He identifies forced interpretations, and then he knows that there's something awry with the text, with the underlying text, or at least that's his intuition. And he tries to excavate the different layers of the text and figure out what went wrong. So he writes, according to the critical method, something must have gone wrong in the transmission of the text that gave rise to the forced interpretation. To overcome that, one has to go back in time, trace the steps of the transmission, point out where the transmission went wrong, and reassemble the pieces in a manner that will obviate the forced interpretation. This kind of process is rather difficult. Some people never take to it, for it requires the dismantling and reassembling of the text. This sort of scholarship, excavating and then reassembling the text, is, at minimum disconcerting and usually deemed heretical by people who from the traditional yeshiva world. But that's the modern critical Talmud scholarship that Halivni began to engage in after he arrived in the United States. And he makes this important point: standard, by that he means traditional. Standard Talmud scholarship assumes contiguity of knowledge, that the late sages in the let's say the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, the late sages had an absolute knowledge of the statements of the early sages, knew their contents and the circumstances that gave rise to them. We critical scholars do not share this assumption. We do not suppose contiguity of knowledge as an absolute given. And when there are blemishes, we suspect a defect in transmission, that the statements of earlier sages did not reach the later sages adequately and completely. The blemishes are not overcome, and by that he means just sort of explained away. At best, we can explain how they came into being, how the historical process gave rise to them. So I just wanted to give you a taste of his incredible mastery of the Talmud led to his having intuition and some more definitive conclusions about the seams in the text of the Talmud, where there were problems, and how later sages may have either mistransmitted or misunderstood or misplaced the statements of earlier sages. And it was only his great mastery of the Talmud that allowed him to generate and refine this incredible intuition about the text that he had and that he tried to transmit to his students. It wasn't easy to pass on that same intuition, because all of his students didn't share his mastery of the Talmud. I wanted to point out something that is I find a bit entertaining. So Halivni was amazing, despite his incredible mind. Even he could be subject to mistakes sometimes. And this is just a small thing that I find interesting. This is my copy of Pshat and Drash. This is the book that I worked on very closely with him. I mentioned in a prior class that he gave the Devar Torah at Joanne and my wedding that was officiated by Rabbi Wexler. Ours was the first wedding in the Or Zaruk community. And Professor Halivni attended, and instead of me, he gave a Devar Torah. And in the wake, following our wedding, when Pshat and Drash, the book, was published, I asked him to sign the book for me. And so he signed it. You won't be able to read it, but here is his handwritten inscription. And in it, I think he had our wedding in mind. So I was the one who had worked very closely with Professor Halivni, but he wrote, "To Joanne Ashley, with love and friendship," and then he signed it. And I got the book and I looked at it and I said, "Oh, Professor Halivni, that's wonderful, but could you mention me too in the inscription?" So there's a little caret to Mark and Joanne Ashley. So these sorts of problems of textual defects, even for a mind as great as Professor Halivni's, that's what he was identifying, these problems in the text. And I wanted just to give you, just to continue this short discussion of his Talmudic scholarship. This is, again, I've quoted another excerpt from it. Jeff Rubenstein was an older colleague of mine in the PhD program at Columbia. As he was finishing his program, I was starting it. He was a student of Halivni's also, and he has a wonderful translation of Halivni's book, The Formation of the Babylonian Talmud, which again is a translation of one of his introductions to, or maybe one or more of his introductions to his magnum opus, Mekorot u'Mesorot. In that volume, Professor Rubenstein writes the Stama'im, and that's a term that was created by Halivni based on a phrase for the anonymous sections of the Talmud, but he came up with this word Stama'im, and by that he meant the anonymous authors of all of the dialectical analytical argumentation that you can find in the Talmud. I'd say 80% of the Talmud is made up of this shakla v'tarya, this dialectical argumentation, and no names are attached to all of that stuff. And he said he credited this group of rabbis who lived between 550. He thought between 550 and 750. He called them the Stamaim. And Jeff Rubenstein correctly characterizes Halivni's scholarship about the Stamaim by writing, the Stamaim were engaged in a massive project of restitution and reconstruction. Alas, because dialectical argumentation had not been passed down in the official transmission of the reciters, most of it had been lost by Stamaitic times. Meaning, by the way, just keep in mind, the Talmud was completely in oral form. So it was not written down, both oral in the sense of not written, O-R-A-L, and also A-U-R-A-L, that you only were able to hear the Talmud. So they had a group of professional reciters. Some of them were scholars, but not all. And it was their job to pass down the Talmud, or the rabbinic learning through the centuries. But they did not pass down, Halivni's theories, they didn't pass down all of the analytical argumentation about the very succinct, categorical, definitive, what he called apodictic statements of earlier sages. And so the Stamaim, the anonymous editors of the Talmud, had to recreate all of that dialectical argumentation. The portions of dialectical argumentation that happen to be preserved therefore contain great variation and many errors. It is this dimension of the transmission process that accounts for the prevalence of force explanation. So that's the pivot, the key in Halivni's scholarship about the Talmud. The prevalence of forced explanations in the Talmud's anonymous stratum. This revolutionary understanding of the Talmudic text has become the foundation for all modern critical Talmud study. So all modern critical students and scholars of the Talmud now use this term, the Stamaim, and essentially accept Halivni's chronology of how the Talmud was put together, both in terms of the fact that it was put into final form much later than tradition ascribes to it. Tradition ascribes to two rabbis of a certain period in the early 5th century, that's when the Talmud was finalized, and no further content was added to it. Halivni thinks no, the process of editing and redacting and finalizing the Talmud took 3 centuries more or so, and the Stamaim were actually the authors of much of what we find in the Talmud today. But the Stamaim, importantly, I want to leave you with the impression that he credits the Stamaim with doing the best they could with sort of misshapen statements or mistransmitted statements. They were doing the best they could to recreate the tradition, the traditions, as he puts it, in Sources and Traditions, the name of his magnum opus, that had come down to him. The sources, the original sources, had become sort of corrupted over time, and the Stamaim did their best to recreate them. Here, I want to move on to sort of what is the solution. So Halivni feels this religious problem, this religious tension, when he focuses on the disparity or the dichotomy between pshat and drash in the Torah, between the plain meaning of the 5 books of Moses on the one hand and rabbinic interpretation on the other. And he has in mind also these textual problems that he discovered, that he uncovered within the text of the Talmud. This is the solution that he comes up with. The dichotomy between the spheres of practice and intellect, and this is from Pshat and Drash, the book, between the realms of halacha, Jewish law on the one hand, and hashkafa, he calls it, philosophy, science, and by that he means the modern critical studies that he's engaged in, and theology on the other. So between halacha and hashkafa is most clearly evident when one realizes that halachic determinations evolve through a process that must bear the burdens of time and space. So the halacha, the Jewish legal system, doesn't often bears hallmarks of certain elements of decision making that may not reflect absolute pristine truth, while matters of hashkafa exist, theoretically at least, above and beyond the flux of time and the shifting of space. That is, practical halakha is shaped by human beings within the workings of historical time and must therefore bear the imprint of temporal and material conditions. In this way, halakha is unavoidably ideological and tinged by subjective human decision-making. Issues, in contrast, issues of theological doctrine and modern critical studies of the sort that Halivni was engaged in cannot be definitively settled merely through the consensus suggested by a vote of the majority. The halachic system, the Jewish legal system, is determined, as we'll see in a moment, by majority rule. He's saying issues of truth about texts and traditions cannot be settled through a vote of the majority, nor by the judgment rendered by the passage of history. Although matters of science, logic, and theology, and I've added in brackets in modern critical studies because that's what he meant, of objective reality can be debated. They cannot ultimately be settled in the chambers of the Sanhedrin. Only intellectual speculation is, in theory, scrupulous in its attachment to logic, truth, and objective reality. Critical scholarship, as the epitome of rigorous intellectual speculation, is or should be constrained by the determinism of pshat, of the plain meaning. Halachic discourse, by contrast, is more pliable and fluid, able to assert its autonomy and confront the sovereignty of Scripture through the devices of drash. And here, this is his important conclusion. Scholarship of the kind that he was engaged in, on the one hand, and religious piety, commitment to Jewish law on the other, can thus function comfortably on different planes. Each can reign supreme in its own domain. So that was his solution. And we'll see how he arrived at it through rabbinic sources. But his solution is, let's separate those two arenas. He's saying my critical scholarship about the text of the Torah and about the text of the Talmud need not and should not have an impact on the Jewish legal system. The two are separate. They have different motivations, different dynamics, different processes. And he writes, as I just read, they can function comfortably on different planes. Now, I've argued he felt fairly comfortable, but I don't think he achieved perfect comfort in his reconciling those two domains, but he thought they should be kept separate. There may still be tension that is the byproduct of keeping them separate, but in his life, they were complementary, but should never converge. And he wrote similarly, this is another article that I worked on with him on man's role in revelation. He wrote there, a non-maximalistic view of revelation. Do you remember I started today with the view of the Chazon Ish, the ultra-Orthodox rabbi who held a very maximalistic view of the revelation, that even rabbinic stories, which almost surely were not meant always, or at least in many circumstances, were not meant to be taken literally. The Chazon Ish said, well, if you don't believe that those were divinely revealed, then you can't perform certain Jewish functions. Halivni writes, in contrast to the Chazon Ish, a non-maximalistic view of revelation thus leads to a necessary acceptance of dichotomism, or a dual exegetical mode, one reserved for practical law, that means for halakha, and one for intellectual endeavor, the kind that he was engaged in. A dichotomy between matters of the intellect and matters of practical law can maintain, and these are the two things he wanted to maintain, halakhic uniformity, so that he wanted to preserve the integrity of the halakhic system while permitting intellectual multiformity. He was innovative and radical in his intellectual scholarship, and he wanted to be able to do both. The notion of dichotomization can be wedded fruitfully to a non-maximalistic conception of revelation. Halakhic homogeneity and intellectual latitude can then be embraced simultaneously. So that was his goal, a commitment on the one hand to halakha, to Jewish law, even though and by that he didn't mean maintaining halakha exactly the same through the ages. He obviously knew that's not how halakha developed, but what he meant by that is a certain commitment to the halakhic system of developing halakha and deciding halakha. But he also wanted the latitude to be the kind of scholar to have the intellectual freedom that he wanted. I argued in the last session that I think, even though he may not have said it so explicitly or publicly, I think he thought of Baruch Spinoza as one of his inspirations. Spinoza, too, was zealously committed to the pshat, to the simple sense of text. And Halivni wanted that same latitude without being branded a heretic, as Spinoza was in his day, centuries earlier. Now, I want to lay out for you just some of the rabbinic sources that gave rise to Halivni's attachment to a non-maximalistic, as we just saw, non-maximalistic conception of the revelation of the oral Torah, which he thought a non-maximalistic conception would much more easily accommodate the sort of intellectual innovation that he was engaged in. And he was able, because he knew he was a master of rabbinic literature, so he knew there were all sorts of sources he could cite, and he wanted to highlight that he thought the Orthodox, and particularly the ultra-Orthodox world in contemporary Judaism, had focused too much on certain of the sources that reflected a maximalistic conception. He wanted, in contrast, to highlight all of the various sources that highlight something less than maximalism. Here's one from a rabbinic midrash, Midrash Tanhuma. It's an interpretation or a gloss on a verse from Exodus. The verse from Exodus is, "And God gave unto Moses when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai," and it continues to say he gave him basically the Torah that was going to be transmitted. And the rabbis wrote there, and by the way, just keep in mind, the traditional conception is that Moses received not just the written Torah on Mount Sinai and through the years of the wilderness journey, but God also imparted to Moses for transmission to the Israelites this massive body of oral Torah that was a companion, an accompaniment to the written Torah. But the rabbis asked, at least in this source, could Moses have possibly learned the entire oral Torah in 40 days on Mount Sinai? I mean, the oral Torah is reflected in the Talmud and in other rabbinic books. It's a massive literature. Could he have learned all that in 40 days? Is it not written, its measure, meaning the measure of the Torah, at least according to this interpretation, its measure is longer than the earth? Rather, it was only the basic principles, the klalim, rather than all of the details of the oral law, that the Holy One, blessed be he, taught Moses. And then it's a play, it's sort of a pun on the word kechalato, and that is similar sounding and some similarity in the shorish and the root of those Hebrew words to klalim, of principles. So this rabbinic source is saying, no, not all of the details that we find in the Talmud and rabbinic literature were revealed. Only the directional principles of the system. And I've covered many of these sources, including this one in prior years. Here's another source that Halivni liked to cite, a very famous story, but I just want to give you Halivni's spin on it, his take on this. Many of you will recognize it. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God said to him, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef, that's the great Rabbi Akiva, is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns, so that if you ever look at a Torah scroll, they have these little lines, the adornments to the letters, and Rabbi Akiva was going to be able to derive meaning from all of those adornments. So he was destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounds upon mounds of halachot, of Jewish laws. It is for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. I want to see who is this great scholar of the Torah. God said to him, return behind you. So sort of go behind you. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall in his Beit Midrash and did not understand what they were saying. So he couldn't follow the Torah discussion. So Moses, the recipient of God's revelation at Mount Sinai of the Torah, could not understand the discussion of the Torah that was transpiring in Rabbi Akiva's his library centuries later. Moses' strength waned as he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. But when Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to my teacher, from where do you derive this? Rabbi Akiva said to them, it is a law transmitted by God to Moses from Mount Sinai, a halacha Moshe Sinai. When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease. And Halivni's point is, and I put it in brackets here, Halivni's point here is this reflects a minimalistic conception of revelation, that only directional general principles were revealed by God to Moses for transmission to the people. And out of those directional principles came the abundance of details that later rabbis, including the great Rabbi Akiva, derived from those principles. And Halivni's point is, this reflects not only a minimalistic conception of the scope of the revelation of the oral Torah, but it reflects the continuity and integrity of the system. Rabbi Akiva was deriving details that did go all the way back in time to the directional principles that God had revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. But none of those details were comprised within the original revelation, and later rabbis who used their creativity and their commitment to the system, like Rabbi Akiva, could derive an abundance of details from those principles. So Halivni thought it showed the continuity and integrity of the system, but that the system itself was based on a minimalistic conception of the scope of the original revelation. Halivni was also a big fan of minority opinions in the Talmud. If you open the Talmud, it is full, chock full, of all sorts of arguments. It doesn't simply record the winning majority argument. So too, by the way, of the Mishnah, the book of Jewish law that was codified in approximately the year 200 CE by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. That the Gemara, the Talmud, is a commentary in the Mishnah. So too in the Mishnah are recorded minority opinions. We know that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued with each other. Almost always Beit Hillel was the winner of those arguments, but the opinions of Beit Shammai, of the minority opinion, were nevertheless still included in the Mishnah. They weren't discarded over time. And Halivni was a fan of Jewish texts, including minority opinions. And this is a citation that he liked to invoke from the Mishnah itself. The Mishnah itself asked, well, why do we record opinions of minority individuals who lost out in the debate? And why do they record the opinion of a single person, so meaning the minority opinion, among the many, along with the majority opinion, when the halacha, when the legal outcome must be according to the opinion of the majority? So the majority opinion, that's the overriding principle of the Jewish legal system. So the answer, one of the two answers given, and the one that Halivni favored, what is the Mishnah, and the same could be true of the Gemara, why do they record minority opinions? So that if a subsequent court prefers the opinion of the single person, so if a subsequent court actually says, oh, we really like that minority opinion, it may depend on him. It may depend on that minority opinion to change the law. Because in the absence of a minority opinion, all we would have is the majority opinion, and we would have no awareness that there was a competing one. And in the absence of a minority opinion, a later court could not overturn the law. It was only by invoking the existence of a minority opinion that a later court, a subsequent court, could refashion and revise the law. And this leads into another Halivni's discussion of another very famous story. Again, I'm not going to discuss the story at great length. It can be interpreted in different ways. What I want to try to give you is Halivni's spin, his take, his perspective on this very famous story. It relates, this is from the Babylonian Talmud, about this oven of Achnai. Again, we're not going to get into the details of that halachic debate, but it was a debate between two rabbis. And one of the rabbis had the weight of all his fellow sages. So it says, one rabbi said it was pure, and the other rabbi said it was impure. The sages taught on that day, when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer, keep in mind in the course of the story, he's the minority opinion. He's the lone voice arguing for his position. Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis, so all the other rabbis in the academy, did not accept his explanations from him. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400. And so I won't read it all here, but Rabbi Eliezer, the story says, brought all sorts of miracles on behalf of his minority opinion, to prove to his fellow rabbis that his opinion was correct. They said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from a stream. And then he continues. And it says, Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls and said to them, but Rabbi Yehoshua is on the other side of the debate. He scolded the walls that had leaned inward to support Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of Jewish law, of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement? The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the deference due Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leading. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha, if the law is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? As the halakha, the law, is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion. So an actual divine voice came down and said, you should agree with Rabbi Eliezer, because even though he's the minority opinion, because he's always right. His opinion is always correct. So the divine voice agreed with the minority position. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven, meaning the Torah is not in heaven. That's a verse from Deuteronomy. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven in this context? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, so God gave over the Torah, he revealed it, it was no longer in God's possession. We do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after majority to incline. So once it was revealed at Mount Sinai, the Torah belonged to us, to human beings. We decide according to the majority, so we can ignore the divine voice that is telling us that Rabbi Eliezer's minority opinion is correct. And then years later, Elijah the prophet says to a rabbi, the Holy One, when he saw this, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me, my children have triumphed over me. So God seems to sort of reconcile God's own self to this majority view. But let me just focus for a moment on Halivni's take. His take on this story, there are all sorts of interpretations, but he thinks the correct one, the main point to get from it, is twofold. One, that minority opinions are very important. That's why he favored including them in Jewish legal texts, because you can always go back to minority opinions. And in this story is telling us, in this case, the minority opinion was actually tantamount to the truth, because God was agreeing with the minority opinion. And secondly, it suggests the divide, the dichotomy that he proposed in the text that we looked at earlier, that he is proposing between intellectual study, which reflects truth, and the halachic system, the mechanics and dynamics of the Jewish legal system on the other. This story is saying the minority opinion of Rabbi Eliezer reflected the truth. God's stamp is emet, is truth. And God was saying, well, the minority opinion here is true, but the halachic system that is predicated on majority view says, no, we're gonna, despite that divine truth that seems to side with the minority opinion, we're gonna decide otherwise. So Halivni focuses here on the compelling nature of minority opinions on the one hand, and the fact that it seems to reflect a divide, a disconnect that he finds perfectly tolerable and actually helpful between intellectual truth on the one hand and halachic Jewish legal decision-making on the other. And I included a couple of Talmudic passages just to show Halivni's point about the sort of variability, the changing nature of the halachic system, that our Jewish, he was comfortable with recognizing that the Jewish legal system does not, in all cases, reflect the truth. He points out in one of his lectures that the two great Amoraic rabbis of the Talmud, Rava and Abaye, engaged. They were a famous duo of Talmudic argumentation. They engaged in about 150 different arguments in the Talmud, and only in 6 cases do we hold like Abaye. So in approximately 144 out of 150 cases, we side with Rava over Abaye. And Halivni's point is, it's highly unlikely that it is only in those 6 cases that Abaye, who's considered a great rabbi in his own right, was wrong about the logic of the implicated argument. But the halachic system, the Jewish legal system, was set up over time with certain rules. So a certain sort of decision-making principle or rule emerged that in almost every case we're going to side with Rava, sort of no matter what the competing arguments are on either side. So Halivni thought that was another example of the sort of mutability, changeability of the halachic system, that in certain circumstances it did not comport precisely with what logical, intellectual truth would tell us. And I just wanted to bring a couple of examples of interesting aspects of the halachic Jewish legal system that reflects this. I'm not going to read this whole thing just in the so that we're more efficient with our use of time, but this reflects the position of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, one of the great Tanaim of the Mishnaic period. So in the early 2nd century, I'll note that Rabbi Yossi Haglili was important enough to be mentioned in the Passover Haggadah. So he was a very important rabbi. And this passage from the tractate of Chulin in the Babylonian Talmud makes clear that Rabbi Yossi Haglili's halachic Jewish legal position was that poultry, so chicken and other kinds of bird, could be eaten with milk. Now, all of us who know anything about kashrut know in these days and for many centuries in the halachic system, our majority rule is that we cannot eat poultry. You can't have chicken with a glass of milk. But Rabbi Yossi Haglili said you could. A great rabbi. That was his position. And Halivni's point was, once there is such an authoritative, respective minority position embedded within the halachic system, at least in concept, in theory, at some later time, the Jewish legal system could resuscitate, revive that minority position, and overturn aspects of the Jewish legal system. So once Rabbi Yossi Haglili voiced an opinion or took a position that was then preserved in the Talmud, it is a respected authoritative minority position that perhaps, in theory and concept, could later be revived. And finally, just a footnote. This is a section of the book Pshat and Drash that I worked on with Halivni. And in that section, a footnote says, as an ironic aside in our discussion of the historical dimension of halachic decision-making. So again, he's contrasting the historical sort of kind of subjective or ideological dimensions of Jewish legal decision-making with a more objective critical scholarship that, or at least the objective interpretations that critical scholarship aspires to. So as an ironic aside in our discussion of the historical dimension of halachic decision-making, it should be noted that a modern Jew who maintains glatt kosher standards would not be able to eat in the medieval home of Maimonides, perhaps the greatest halachist of Jewish history, because of the greater stringency of the halachic regimen today. So Halivni is noting the irony. Maimonides, perhaps the greatest Jew, from Moses in the Torah to Moses, Maimonides, there was no one greater. So certainly one of the handful of greatest Jews in history, or in the top 10, we'll say. He, a glatt kosher eater today, couldn't eat in his home because the standards of kashrut have evolved. And that's, sort of an ironic point. I want to move on, and I do want to mention, and I just want to talk about for a few minutes, but I don't want to dwell on because it could be its own class. I have mentioned that Professor Halivni left the Jewish Theological Seminary um, and went to Columbia just down the street because of the very tumultuous issue of the ordination of women rabbis um, that really emerged in the late 1970s and then ultimately came to a vote in 1983. Halivni, we'll see that Halivni opposed the process and decision of ordaining women in the way that it was being presented to him. He thought that the process was faulty and it was rushed in a way that he thought did not comport with halachic decision making. And as a result, he felt he couldn't even participate in the vote. He decided he writes that it was a very painful decision to leave JTS. He had been an adjunct teacher at Columbia for many years, so Columbia was very familiar with him. He moved down the street, and as I mentioned, that's where I encountered him. I encountered him and became his teaching assistant shortly after this whole episode of Halivni leaving JTS. But you're right. So despite the points I've been raising about Halivni's affection for minority opinions and the minimalist conception of the oral law, he was still zealously committed to the halachic system and thought you have to work from within the system. So I mentioned earlier, if there were minority opinions, perhaps one could tap into those to announce changes in Jewish law. But in the absence of what he thought were viable, respected minority positions, you could not do that. You could not go outside the halachic system to make changes. And he writes in his memoir, what finally convinced me that I had to leave JTS was not so much the actual decision in favor of the reforms, and by that he means primarily the vote to ordain female rabbis. On the contrary, I greatly sympathize with some of the problems they addressed, and I'm trying to alleviate them by recruiting serious female students to the Talmud program at Columbia University with the hope that when they become scholars, they themselves will discover solutions. He had many female students, some of whom I took classes with when I was his student. Rather, the implications of the process and decision were intolerable to me. The reforms were interpreted to mean that halakha had bowed to modernity. In the present climate of opinion, doing away with a law which the media and the modern temper have little sympathy for and may even consider immoral will ipso facto be interpreted as a clash between modernity and halakha in general, with the latter retreating. Halakha, Jewish law, is then reduced to the status of folklore, or at best to a mode of behavior that served Jews well, in the past, but like everything else in history, needs periodic adjustments to be viable today. That will set a pattern for the future. Wherever halakha and modernity collide, halakha yields. And then he writes, this is he excerpted from a letter that he wrote to the JTS faculty shortly before the vote, again, in which he decided not to participate. He wrote, I have studied, restudied, and examined the examples some scholars say indicate that the rabbis consciously changed the Jewish law for either ethical or moral reasons. Some of the people who were supporting the ordination of women were saying, well, it's legitimate to change Jewish law simply on the basis of a new compelling ethical or moral rationale. And he writes, I have found no tangible evidence to support such a thesis. And he writes down here, changes to halakha did take place, but they were not done consciously. He didn't think there was evidence that rabbis said, oh, let's just change a law because we want to reflect an evolving ethical value. And he writes, I am committed to Jewish tradition in all of its various aspects. I cannot therefore participate in a debate on a religious issue of major historical significance where the traditional halachic decision-making process is not sufficiently honored, its specific instructions as to who is qualified to pass judgment not sufficiently reckoned with. Again, I'm not going to get into this in much detail. There are fascinating articles and essays and books reflecting this whole process about the ordination of women at JTS in the late 70s and early 80s that led to Halivni leaving. But he found fault with the process. There was a commission created comprised of lay people, and to Halivni, who made a recommendation to the JTS faculty. And to Halivni, those people were not well suited to make determinations of Jewish law. He thought it should be experts on Jewish law, including himself. He was, at the time, the leading sort of active figure of Talmud at JTS. His great mentor, Rabbi Saul Lieberman, was still there and was still considered the greatest Talmudist and the greatest Talmudic scholar at JTS. But Halivni was his primary disciple and successor. And Halivni thought, let's not have people who were not experts in or qualified to make halachic determinations. Let's not have those people making this important decision. And he wrote, this is from an essay he wrote that was circulated to JTS faculty in advance of the vote, that was not later included in the book about women's ordination that included the various responsa of other rabbis and scholars at JTS about the issue. He wrote there, unless one is abandoning halakha altogether and makes one decision solely on the basis of present-day sociological norms, even if one assumes that the main barrier for the ordination of women is their exemption from the time-bound obligations, that was the crux of the halachic debate, that women are not subject generally to time-bound commandments, with some important exceptions, and therefore, even if they take it upon themselves, have difficulty becoming people for whom commandments are actually commanded and not discretionary. And if you're not such a commanded person, and in pre-modern Judaism, all commanded people in Judaism were males. If you're not that kind of person, you can't act as an agent functioning as a rabbi to perform certain rites, certain activities in Jewish law, including, importantly, for Halivni, the marriage ceremony. He thought could not, at least tomorrow, the day after the vote, could not be performed by women. And he writes, it is extremely doubtful that it can be achieved through extracting promises from a few individuals. He means the few women who would be willing to take upon themselves all of the time-bound commandments. The rapidity with which the decision to ordain women is being foisted upon us has prevented us from studying the subject dispassionately and has precluded any possible solution that further study may yield. Pressure to ordain women through public hearings and media releases is an affront to all those who take halakha seriously. That is, a halakha based on revelation as interpreted by the sages throughout the ages, a position to which JTS is committed from its very inception. And by the way, JTS purported to make the decision to ordain women on the basis of halakha, on the basis of Jewish law. The main responsum written by Rabbi Joel Roth, who was another of my teachers at JTS when I was a student of Halivni's. Before I took Halivni's graduate seminar, I took a senior rabbinical school Talmud class with Joel Roth, and Rabbi Roth wrote the main responsum to support the ordination of women. So JTS was saying, we are basing this on halakha. Halivni simply, in his mind, could not find sufficient respected minority opinion to say, on the day after the vote, women can function as rabbis. He thought it should take about a generation. Let's have women who commit themselves to taking on the full yoke of the commandments, all of them, and after a generation or so, it will be appropriate to ordain women as rabbis. He thought that the decision was based on a faulty process because it included unqualified people making the decision, and was rushed in the sense of moving halakha to change at a rate that was not natural. Okay, so I'm going to pivot from there about Halivni's thinking about the halachic system, about his view of minority opinions, of his view of a minimalist conception of the oral law. And I want to pivot back to the tension he felt in light of all of that, to the deviation of drash, of rabbinic interpretation from pshat in the Torah. That remained once he realized that his commitment to pshat was generating this problem, that he saw that rabbinic exegesis, rabbinic interpretations deviated from what he thought was the pshat, the simple meaning of Torah, and the same problem was generated in his Talmud scholarship, that he saw that the plain meaning of certain earlier statements of rabbis was the plain sense was either misinterpreted or as a function of mistransmission, misunderstood by later rabbis. So this gap between rabbinic interpretation and earlier texts. I want to show you the important role that he ascribed to Ezra the scribe. Ezra HaSofer, we have one of the books of Tanakh is called Ezra, and historically the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah were almost surely a single book. They've now been separated into two for purposes of our contemporary Tanakh a few centuries ago. But Halivni really creates an incredibly important role for Ezra, who lived in the 5th century BCE. Okay, so this is before the Common Era, after the Second Temple had been rebuilt, but it was really sort of a moribund period of Jewish history. Despite the rebuilding of the temple, the community, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah tells us that the people had been intermarrying, the Torah was being neglected. The book of Nehemiah says, our king's officers, priests, and fathers did not follow your teaching and did not listen to your commandments or to the warnings that you gave them. So this is evidence in Halivni's mind of really neglect of the Torah text. And by the way, I entitled this section From Spinoza to Halivni, the Formative Role of Ezra the Scribe. We'll see. There is sufficient evidence in the rabbinic tradition for the important role that Halivni ascribes to Ezra, but Spinoza really also ascribed a very important role to Ezra, and I think Halivni may have been influenced by that. Halivni cites this verse from this is from our Tanakh in the book of Ezra. For Ezra had dedicated himself to study the teaching of the Lord so as to observe it. Ki Ezra hechin levavo lidrosh et Torat Hashem v'la'asot. And Halivni focuses on this word lidrosh. That is where the word midrash comes from. It's the same Hebrew root. And Halivni is saying Ezra was really engaged in the sort of rabbinic exegesis of the Torah that became so pervasive later on. And Ezra played, in Halivni's view, an incredibly formative role in rescuing the text of the Torah for all the centuries to follow. Now, I mentioned that there's evidence in rabbinic literature of the great role assigned to Ezra. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. It is taught in a Braita, so that's a Tanaitic passage that was not included in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi says, Ezra was deserving, given his greatness, for the Torah to be given by him to the Jewish people, had Moses not come first. So there are various passages in rabbinic literature that say Ezra was such a great figure that, let's assume that Moses never existed, the Torah could have been revealed by God to Ezra. He was of similar stature to Moses. Halivni also cited this very important passage about Ezra's apparent capacity and authority to actually amend, to change the text of the Torah. In this rabbinic text, it says, some give another reason why the dots, and these are referred to in scholarly literature as the puncta extraordinaria. These are 10 examples. For those familiar with Torah reading, if you read the Torah and you come to these 10 instances in the Pentateuch, in the 5 books of Moses, there are dots above certain letters and certain words in the Torah. Still in the scrolls that we read from today, there are dots above certain mysterious dots. And the rabbis, they had the same dots in their time, and they wanted to know, why are there dots in our Torahs? And it says, this is the reason. Ezra reasoned thus. If Elijah, so the prophet Eliyahu, comes and asks, Ezra, why have you written these words in the Torah? That is, why have you included these suspicious or suspect phrases and letters? I, Ezra, shall respond, that is why I dotted these phrases. And so Ezra is saying, well, I wasn't sure about those words, that's why I put dots above them. And if he says to me, if Elijah says to Ezra, you have done well in having written them, then I, Ezra, shall erase the dots. So I'll remove the dots. So we'll know that those words are the correct ones. what Halivni's argument is, this text implies that though these are just the 10 uncertain instances, the instances in which Ezra the scribe was uncertain about whether he could change the text of the Torah, that he actually had the authority, if he thought there was a mistransmission, that the text of the Torah had become corrupted over time, he could change it and correct it and revive the original text. And then we have these 10 instances in which he was uncertain. So I want to show you how Spinoza also attributed great importance to Ezra. We actually looked at this text in my class on Spinoza last year. He writes, I will begin with the received opinions concerning the true authors of the sacred books. And I won't read it all. He says that, tradition says that was Moses. And then he goes on to say, and this is something we discussed in last year's class on Spinoza, Ibn Ezra, who is the commentator that Rabbi Bolton is focusing on this year, who lived in the 12th century. Ibn Ezra thought that certain passages in the Torah were not written by Moses. And in his day, that was a problematic and potentially heretical position. And Spinoza concludes from the foregoing, but Spinoza, by the way, agrees with Ibn Ezra and goes well beyond him. From the foregoing, it is clear beyond a shadow of doubt that the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, was not written by Moses, but rather by someone who lived many generations after Moses. We can conclude that all of the books of the Hebrew Bible that we have so far considered are the works of other hands, and that their contents are narrated as ancient history. So they weren't written by Moses, they were written by someone who came far long after, centuries later. I cannot imagine that anyone but Ezra the scribe was the writer of these books. So Spinoza credits Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe, with writing the books of the Bible. Even certain modern critical biblical scholars, Richard Elliott Friedman, I think, credits Ezra with an important redaction role in the creation of the Bible. And so too, Halivni credits Ezra with an important role in actually finalizing and addressing the text of the Torah. And he has a whole theory that he and I worked on together. I helped convey in English, that he wrote about in Pshat and Drash, and in the other article, Chatu Yisrael. He had a theory that he called Chatu Yisrael, that the Jews during the post-Mosaic and First Temple period were sinful, they engaged in idolatry, they neglected the text of the Torah, and as a result of that neglect, the text of the Torah was corrupted. He wrote in Pshat and Drash, a consequence of this process of sinning and correlative neglect of the text of the Torah, therefore, was the phenomenon of a divine text whose Pshat, in some places, had become corrupt, and thus in need of midrashic emendation. Rabbinic drash, that's the interpretation, that seems to deviate from the Pshat, he writes, actually restores the genuine Pshat of these problematic, corrupted verses, displacing the current Pshat, which through this corrosive process of sinning had become textually entrenched. So the text had, in certain cases, had become so entrenched it couldn't be changed. These instances of problematic Pshat, however, were not allowed to become exegetically canonized, primarily because of the restorative efforts of Ezra in the early Second Temple period. So Ezra, Halivni believed, had the capacity to change the text of the Torah when he could, but because the text had been around for so long, in many cases, it had become too entrenched. He couldn't change the text, so he made sure that the proper rabbinic interpretation reflected in the drash became the canonical interpretation of the corrupted text. So he impelled this process of the rehabilitation of the text of the Torah through these puncta extraordinaria that I mentioned earlier, but more pervasively through this process of ensuring that drash became the consensus understanding of the text of the Torah. And through that solution, through Halivni's reliance on the important role of Ezra, he writes, and therein lies the religious Jews' guarantee that the Torah is, in some places, textually blemished. His halacha lema'aseh, our body of practical law, does correspond with and express the divine will as embodied in the original revelation. So this was his solution to the problem of the deviation of drash from pshat. He's saying drash actually comes to sort of correct the corrupted pshat in places where they do deviate and where the text of the Torah could not be changed by Ezra. So our body of rabbinic interpretation, that's actually the real authorial intention of God in the Torah. So that represented his solution. Mindful of time, I'm going to skip this next text, which is sort of a critique of Halivni's view. It's interesting, but I'm going to skip it. I'm going to end with this section. So I'll just go for a few more minutes and then open it up for questions. I want to end. I asked you at the beginning of this section to keep in mind that photo of Professor Halivni as a young boy of 11, 4 years before he gained rabbinic ordination in Sighet, Romania, about 8 years before he arrived in the United States. When he arrived as an orphan, the 4 other members of his family in that photo were all killed in the Holocaust. I wanted you to carry that picture with you because he never left that sort of image of himself as a boy growing up in the old world, in that Orthodox yeshiva world of pre-Holocaust Eastern Europe. That never left him. He evolved from it, but I think it was always a part of his character, a part of his personality, and he reacted to it, but also drew inspiration from it. And he writes this was a book, really the last English book about his thought, Breaking the Tablets, Jewish Theology After the Shoah, after the Holocaust. He writes there, very pointedly, there were 2 major theological events in Jewish history, the revelation at Sinai and revelation at Auschwitz. The former was a revelation of God's presence, the latter a revelation of God's absence. The former indicated God's nearness to us, the latter God's distance. At Sinai, God appeared before Israel, addressed us, and gave us instructions. He means the commandments. At Auschwitz, God absented himself from Israel, abandoned us, and handed us over to the enemy. I return later in the book to the theme of this prologue, how, having faced God's absence, we pray for him. Halivni remained a pious Jew to the end of his life. We pray for him to rule over us once again, and in his nearness, to illumine the meaning of his Torah. In the meantime, so Halivni is saying, before that happens, the life I'm pursuing, the life I'm trying to live, is dedicated to this. Our study turns toward recovering the plain sense of Torah behind the maculations of the human hand. So that was what drove Halivni. That was what inspired him. What motivated him was to try to recover what did God want of us in both the Torah and as reflected in the Talmud. Yes, the texts of the Torah and of the Talmud may have been corrupted in some respects through transmission in the centuries, but his life's work was dedicated to uncovering the original plain sense, the pshat of the Torah that would reflect God's will for us. Again, the pshat of both the Torah and the Talmud. I'm going to skip this, in which he says, this text I'm skipping here was about, I'll just say, read the end. I undertake critical studies of the Talmud. So he acknowledges, look, I'm studying the Talmud in a way that's not traditional. But at the same time, the Talmud is my bastion, which I can always come home to and find solace in. The Talmud was his whole life. It was his refuge, his source of comfort and security, despite the fact that his scholarship about the Talmud was quite radical and quite innovative. And I thought, I mentioned in the prior sessions, there were some wonderful eulogies, both written and spoken, about Professor Halivni after his death last year. There was a symposium in the work Lair House that comes out on a weekly basis. This was from the eulogy written by Ellie Fisher. And I thought, I agree with it fully, and I thought Fisher captures really nicely the sort of motivation behind all of Halivni's work in the light or in the wake of the Holocaust. Perhaps Professor Halivni's twin theories about the restoration of the Torah, meaning by Ezra the scribe, and formation of the Talmud, that was his heroes, Halivni's heroes in the Talmud were the Stamaim, the anonymous redactors. His notion of how the heirs of a grand but broken tradition made their best effort to reassemble the shards and fragments into something whole originates in his own personal experience. He was raised in Sighet, Romania, a major center of Torah in Greater Hungary. At the time, it was Romania, in a tradition that emphasized vast erudition. He was recognized as a prodigy, an Ilui, and he was considered an accomplished Torah scholar already as a teenager. But that life, the entire culture in which he was raised, was shattered into a million pieces during the spring and summer of 1944. Surviving alone and reaching the shores of a land so different, Halivni himself had to undergo what he later ascribed to Ezra and the Stamaim, of picking up the shattered fragments and attempting to reassemble them into something whole, but in a new and vastly different set of circumstances and sensibilities. The result, the best result we can hope for, is a good faith effort by human beings to recover God's word. Inevitably, it will not be the same as what was lost and will be all too human, yet it is the only path forward. Professor Halivni's life's work was devoted to understanding the individuals, the Stamaim in the Talmud and Ezra the scribe with respect to the Torah, who sought to reassemble the fragmented word of God. But maybe, and this is what I do believe Fisher is correct in noting, but maybe Halivni was drawn to these individuals. Maybe he was able to perceive the traces of their work so clearly and intuitively because he viewed himself as being engaged in a similar process of reassembling the word of God from shards of a shattered world. I thought that captured well Halivni's, his entire body of work, his entire scholarship, in light of his the trauma he endured in the Holocaust. And I want to end by reading this passage from Vayikra Rabbah. This is a work of rabbinic literature from the early centuries of the Common Era. This is about how elite you have to be a master of the Talmud, as Halivni was. It is the way of the world that 1,000 people enter the study of the Bible, so enter the Mikra, the scripture, the Torah, and only 100 of them complete it. So out of 1,000 people who try to study Torah, only 100 of them sort of do a sufficiently good job. 100 enter the study of Mishnah. So that was the code of Jewish law, redacted in about 200, and only 10 of them complete it. So 100 try to study Mishnah, only 10% of those actually complete it. 10 enter the study of Talmud, and by that, this rabbinic passage means all of the argumentation that was generated about the Mishnah that was the term later that came to describe the Babylonian Talmud. So only 10 enter the study of Talmud, and only 1 completes it. So only 1 out of the original 1,000 becomes a master of the Talmud. Only 0.1%, this rabbinic passage is telling us, becomes a true master of the Talmud. This is the meaning of the verse from Ecclesiastes, I have found only 1 person from among 1,000. So this is about how special you have to be a master of the Talmud. And I'll just end by saying that in my view, Professor Halivni was much more than just 1 out of 1,000. I think he was 1 person from among many millions of Jews who approached study of the Talmud. So he went far beyond the 0.1% reflected here. Zichrono livracha, may his memory be a blessing for all of us, for the Jewish people, for a long time to come. So I'll stop there, and I will open it up. I know it's late for any questions. So if you had it, please raise your hand if you do, and unmute. Yes, Barry.
Mark, that was fantastic. Can you? I'm sure it's not easy to do quickly, but could you outline the difference that exists today for modifying halakha in conservative Judaism compared to Orthodox Judaism?
That's a big question, Barry. The conservative movement is still dedicated to the halachic system. And so JTS, whenever it tweaks or modifies halakha, purports to do so on the basis of halachic precedent. I would say that the Orthodox world probably believes that JTS, the conservative movement, is too open, too enthusiastic about making those changes, too flexible about relying on minority opinions, on reinterpreting prior precedent as allowing for change. So I think that's, to the extent that the conservative movement remains, and I think it purports to, remains a halachic movement. I think the difference is that in certain respects, the conservative movement is more flexible about making those changes. And again, it goes back to a point I made about Halivni. He was in favor of ordaining women, but he just thought the halachic system had to be respected. The process and mechanics of the system had to be respected in a way that it wasn't quite being respected at the time. And so he's, in using those terms, Barry, he said, I need to be a little bit more orthodox when it comes to this issue than I have felt I could be at JTS.
And could you just say a word or two about the process that's used by both groups at present?
Rabbi Bolton could speak perhaps better than I can about this. I think the process purports to be the same, that the primary scholars in the conservative movement and rabbis who are making proclamations of halachic decisions look to the same sources as Orthodox rabbis would. They look to the entire body of rabbinic literature and try to find, if they have in mind to consider a change, they try to find precedents and views in those sources that would allow them to rely on those precedents to make whatever tweaks or modifications or allowances that they want. So I think the process is the same. They may be more open-minded about relying on certain aspects of our tradition that an Orthodox rabbi might be. But I would say there's substantial overlap between how an Orthodox rabbi would go about it and how a traditionally committed conservative rabbi would go about it.
Thank you.
I just want to add, Mark, that in this moment, I think that we can see a development within conservative thinkers, some who are considered some of the leading folks, that they really want to change the name of the Jewish Law Committee to the Committee on Jewish Living and Standards, and that the purporting to be halachic in facing the reality of the current community is becoming a big issue when it comes to whether or not any of what Schechter called small c Catholic Israel is really committed to a halachic way of life. Elliot down the street, my colleague Rabbi Cosgrove, just wrote that article in a thought journal called Sapir, where he suggested these names, as people have over time liked to do. For ideological purposes, Rabbi Dorff, who's on the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, already argued that morality and some thought in modernity might sometimes come to trump halachic minority or majority opinion. And one of the reasons why Dr. Weiss Halivni had a break was because that trend of moral compunction or some good idea in modernity that seemed to define morality and then paint the others as being immoral if they wouldn't go that direction was very much at bay when it came to discussing this a couple of decades ago. So it's a great question and rises in this class as an important one for the break that he made with JTS. Mark, did my text?
Rabbi, I'll just add to what you said, just in response to Barry's question. So Halivni, in light of what the rabbi just said, would feel further uncomfortable within that sort of evolution. He believed in the halakhic system that, to the extent changes were going to be made, they had to be made from within that internal process. You could look for and rely on minority opinions, but you couldn't go outside the system to say, here's an important value, it is extraneous to the halakhic system, let's make a change on the basis of that value. He would not accept that.
Mark, did my chats come through? I had three.
They did, Rabbi. I didn't read them. I didn't have a chance to look at them.
I'll just give voice to each of them. I think at Or Zarua, we feel like we follow halachic commitments of our ancestors in a deeper way than many congregations. And we also entertain scholarly commentary on Torah, even during the Kriya, during worship. I wonder if Dr. Weiss Halivni really talked about the place of scholarship within the spiritual community of the synagogue. And it seems like he really does truly believe that God did reveal and does reveal at the Torah time, and revealed in a certain way an absence, as you came up with. But given that notion, I think he uses the word once in a passage you quoted, folklore. And I think he's also addressing Kaplan and breaking with Kaplan as much as he broke with JTS, to say that these are not folkways, but these are really interpretations of a godly revelation, the best we can. And I wondered if you had private conversation with him about his feelings about Kaplan, who was really blamed to not only create a sense of God as the power that makes salvation, but even on the slippery slope, a God who just seeks self-fulfillment as a Jew. And I think he really was making a conscious break with him, and I haven't heard a lot about that over his career or in the eulogies. And I wonder if that came up at all.
Robert, the simple answer is I don't recall having any conversations with Halivni about Mordechai Kaplan. Halivni tended to focus on, he saw as sort of his rivals and people with whom he wanted to engage in dialogue, serious scholars of rabbinic literature. I don't think he thought that there wasn't room at JTS for people who had different views. But what he was focused on was sort of, how do I navigate the tensions that are generated through grappling seriously with the traditional halachic system and the traditional text of the Torah. So he may have found Kaplan's views creative and interesting, but I don't think he really engaged with him as sort of a competitive thought source or thought process. And he as you noted, Halivni did not believe halakha was simply the customs of the people or the folklore of the people. He believed, so to the end of his life, I think, that God revealed the Torah at Mount Sinai, and that it became sort of tarnished and corrupted through time, and we can do our best to recover God's authorial intention as best we can, both as reflected in the Torah and in the Talmud. So he didn't really want to venture into what is viewed today as modern biblical critical scholarship, that the Torah emerges from various sources. I've mentioned here, and I've mentioned, you know how much I enjoy reading the Torah.com. I've had I included passages from the Torah.com in this class. There are people, as you know, who believe in the halachic system while also being willing to engage in modern biblical criticism. Halivni didn't really want to engage in that debate. He did ascribe corruption to the Torah text, but he still maintained a belief that originally it was a pristine revelation from God. So for him, a lot of that was a slippery slope. He was willing to engage in radical conclusions and scholarship about the Talmud, less so about the Torah, although he was willing to go a certain level with the Torah itself, and even less so in characterizing halakha as, sort of folklore. Anyone else with a question? Okay, I don't see hands raised, and I know it's the hour is late, but I want to thank everyone for joining me. I hope you found interesting our discussion of the life and learning of David Weiss Halivni. As the rabbi noted, I think his teaching, his scholarship, and the paradigm and the role model that he was in his own piety and commitment to Jewish tradition can really serve as an inspiration for many of us. So I hope you find that his life and learning can have that sort of guidance for you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Really great.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, guys.
Mark, I don't think I told you, but several years ago in Rabbi Wexler, when he was doing the Talmud class, Halivni came and talked to our class. And I do remember that he talked about the people who were, could memorize the Talmud and were kind of the, what would I call them? They like, they were the speakers, and he
called them the reciters.
Stop. What were they called?
The reciters in English.
the reciters, and they could start and stop, you know, they were
Yep.
expressed, please start at this point so we can have it, instead of like trying to read it. They would at any point they wanted. But he also emphasized that because of that, there could be oral mishearings and miscommunications because the words seemed to be similar, but it was like an oral mistake that happened.
Right. So, you know, look, Halivni himself could have served as one of those reciters in the ancient world, but he was realistic about the process of transmission, both in terms of written text and oral text, in both of those senses, that defects in transmission are a function of human frailty and human reality. So he recognized those problems.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yes, Jerry.
This brings up a question I had earlier in terms of distinguishing perhaps two words. You mentioned early on, it's in my chat.
Yeah,
I don't have your chat.
Continuity and something else,
The-
congruity. Was it continuity and something that
Oh,
was similar?
Continuity and contiguity.
Contiguity.
Yeah. So
And
the difference is
Could you distinguish the two? Which did you mean?
The traditional conception of what he's referring to as contiguity of knowledge is sort of, if you're a sage later in time, you have at your disposal and in your mind everything that was said by earlier rabbis. So it does reflect continuity also, but it means sort of everything that earlier sages said was fodder for academic discussions among later sages, and they knew everything that was said and discussed in earlier times. And that is not an assumption of modern critical scholarship. So modern critical scholars like Halivni did not believe that later sages had at their disposal in correct form everything that was said and spoken by earlier sages. As Bobby's question just referenced, he believed there were defects in transmission that led to misunderstandings of earlier texts. So he did not credit, as an historian, as a scholar, he did not credit later sages with sort of knowing everything that had been said by earlier sages. That assumption was abandoned, and in recognition of the fact that the text reflected certain transmission problems. Okay, with that, I'm going to end and just say thank you again. I hope you found the class worthwhile.
Really great.
Bravo and thank you.
So much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.